Frank Lucas likes to think of himself as just a plain businessman. He buys his products directly and cuts out the middleman to sell to his buyers.
Go and get yourself a new suit.
His product is twice as good at half the price. The only problem is that his product is heroin. Richie is on a mission to destroy any drug dealer that he finds in his way, as he is the honest cop in the industry.
Charges of taking bribes from drug traffickers.
It begins as Bumpy Johnson gives out food to people for Thanksgiving. Frank and he go on a walk and enter a quiet electronics store. Bumpy Johnson gets a heart attack and dies. Many officials were at his funeral, as he is known as a good man, but not a gangster. A man comes up to Frank and tells him the promise he made to Bumpy. Frank knows that many people owe Bumpy money, and he's sure he'll get it back.
Bumpy Johnson, age 62 when he passed.
Richie, who is after drug dealers, and his partner Javier go to a man named Carlo and beat him up. They then blackmail him to show them someone. Jay and Richie waited in the car after spotting a car and to see who came to get it. Richie is impatient and he goes over to the car with Jay to see what's inside. They find a load of money. Jay insists that they keep the money, but Richie decides to turn it back to the police. Frank is with Russie, a friend of Bumpy, and he learns about how the cops, especially a man named Detective Trupo, do business with gangsters. Frank then meets with two boys who tell him about Nate, who he calls his cousin, and that he opened a club for himself. He then takes them where they get injections with drugs. Frank is having a meal in a cafe when Tango comes up to him and tells him that he owns the streets now and that he has to pay 20%. Frank is keeping the work of Bumpy and tells him that not even Bumpy gets 20%. Richie learns that his wife, Lori, is taking their son to her sister's in Las Vegas.
The St. Regis, what do you care?
Frank calls Nate and goes to see him in Bangkok. He wanted to smuggle 100 kilos of heroin into the US, so they both go into the jungle to make a deal. Frank leaves after paying all he has for the transportation of the package. He transported it using the General Army's airplanes. Jay calls Richie and tells him he killed a man in an apartment. Richie gets there as fast as he can and takes the dead man through the crowd as if they were taking him to the hospital. In the van, Richie learns that Jay stole money from the man. Jay begs him to cover up for him, but when he tells him he won't, Jay jumps out of the van. Frank gets the package tested before he distributes it as a baby milk powder and in different forms. Richie is in a courtroom on a case against his wife. He wants to take custody of his son, but he doesn't seem to care about it at all. He is not a good father to his kid, and he also cheats on Lori. He gets a call as he is having an affair with his attorney. He went to find Jay dead and found one of the packages of Frank's heroin, which he took as evidence. A man comes up to Richie and offers him to work for the Special Narcotics Bureau and that he will only answer to him and the U.S. attorney. Richie then went to get a house for himself. Frank brings his entire family out of their old place and buys them a mansion. They all sit by the table and have a meal before Frank takes his mother and shows her the bedroom. He showed her a kind of dresser that she used to have, and she finds it all perfect.
I love you too much.
Frank takes his relatives to the city and tells them about Bumpy and all he did. When they ask what he's selling, he shows them the house his drug gets packed in. They went out for a meal, and Frank spots Tango from a crowd and goes over to talk to him. Tango asks Frank for money, but Frank shoots him right in the head in front of the crowd. He goes back to his family and continues to talk as if nothing's happened. Richie tries to find the drug dealer using the evidence he found on Jay and by making civilians operate with him. He learns that the drug is 100% pure and that it's sold cheaper compared to other drugs and that it's everywhere on the street. Frank attends a fancy party prepared for him and sees Miss Puerto Rico, Ava. He calls out Huey Lucas and questions him about how he's dressed too loudly and that the loudest one in the room is the weakest. He goes out and Ava introduces herself to him.
You leaving?
Richie decides to start again from the street looking for the dealer. He sets up a trap to track down the source of the drugs. He orders a guy and works in a car wash to get him some. He takes the money from his boss, who tells him not to lose it. He pays the guy and follows him with his guy. The man drives to New York, and Richie follows him with a cap after hitting the driver to take the car. Once he stops at a cafe, he sees that Detective Trupo and his team have taken the bag with the money. He follows them and tells them that he is from Newark and that the money bills are sequenced. It's registered, and he asks them to check it. They see that it's true and give him back his money before Trupo tells him to never step foot in the city again, unannounced. Frankie brings Ava home and tells her about Bumpy before he introduces her to his mother. Richie gets a visit from Child Services, who mentions his friend and a godfather of his son, Joey. Richie asks Joey about blue magic and if he knows where it comes from, but can't get any information. Frank's business has spread all over the States, and he's making more and more money. One day, at a party in his house, a detective starts stirring up a commotion, and Jimmy, a cousin of Frank, shoots him in the leg. Frank gets angry and beats him in front of everyone before he orders him to be sent back home. He gets invited to Dominic, and he goes with Ava. Dominic tells him to consider his competitors when setting a price for his products. He then offers to work with him to sell the drug nationwide, and Frank agrees to work together. Ava gives Frank a fur coat, and he wears it to the boxing match he attended. Everyone was at the event, but nobody knew who Frank was. Frank catches the eyes of Richie. He takes a picture of him and questions his team about who he is before he orders them to investigate. Frank and Ava get married, and Trupo finds them as they are leaving the ceremony. Trupo tells Frank to pay him $10,000 at the beginning of every month, or he will get him arrested. Frank burrs the coat Ava gave him. Richie follows Frank and reports to his boss on his findings. He assumes that Frank is working under someone else and that they should find out who that person is. On Thanksgiving Day, Frank gives out food, just like how Bumpy used to do. Trupo gets a gift on his doorstep before his car blows up. Frank is talking with one of his cousins when Huey calls him and tells him that there's been a problem. He learns that the quality of the drugs he sells is down by 3%. Frank goes to visit a man named Nicky, who's been selling Frank's products by mixing it with his and using the name Blue Magic. Frank has a talk with him to stop what he's doing. As he and Huey were leaving, they get stopped by Trupo and his men. They find some drugs in Frank's car, but he threatens that he will blow up Trupo's house next, and they all leave. Joey calls Richie to his place and offers him a house in Aspen in exchange for leaving Frank alone. Richie gets offended and leaves. He kept the investigation going on Frank. In the case with Lori, he apologizes to her, but she gets mad at him for thinking he's an honest man. His attorney starts to speak in favor of him, but he stops her and tells Lori to take their kid with her, since he's in no state to keep him. During Christmas time, Frank and Ava went out, even though Frank was hesitant, saying that Bumpy used to stay in on Christmas, and because the whole house was surrounded by Trupo and his men. They go to get a meal, but Ava wants to stay in the car, so Frank goes to get the keys while she waits inside. As he was returning to the car, a shooting fires at Ava, but Frank gets there in time and saves her. Back at home, Ava tells him that they should leave, but he tells her that they're staying. Trupo goes to see Richie and offers that he doesn't arrest Frank and that they make money off of him. But Richie dismisses him. Frank sees Dominic and tells him he doesn't feel safe and that he needs to know who shot him. Frank soon learns that the army in Bangkok is going home since the war is over, meaning that he has no means to transport his packages. He decided to go over to Nate. Richie and his men caught Jimmy while trying to kill a woman out in the street. They blackmail him into turning Frank to them. In the meanwhile, Frank is in Bangkok, deciding on what to do about the transportation. He calls Huey to tell him the plane number of the package that will arrive, and Richie hears the whole thing with his team. Once the plane arrived, Richie went there to check for the package. Trupo goes to Frank's house, where Ava and his mother are. He asks for money that Frank has hidden. Richie checks every corner of the plane and finally orders to open the coffins of the soldiers, but is stopped by a man. On the other hand, Trupo kills Frank's dog and finds the money hidden under the kennel. Richie gets in trouble for trying to check the coffins. He leaves and starts following the car that took the coffins, where he ends up finding Stevie. Frank gets home and learns about what happened. His mother tried to talk some sense into him.
One who doesn't seem to know is you.
Richie follows the truck that the drug is in and calls to get a warrant. Frank is at church with his mom and Ava. Richie invades the whole block and gets to the place where the drugs are being worked on. Huey escapes the shooting, but Richie follows him until he catches him. Once he arrested all of Frank's brothers, he came to church to get him too. After being arrested, Frank asks to talk with Richie. Richie asks him to give the names of the police officers who work with gangsters. After a long talk, Frank agrees, and Richie makes the arrests. Trupo hears about it all and kills himself. Frank gets sentenced to 70 years in prison, and his 30 family members are sent to prison too. Richie quits and becomes a defense attorney, where he defends Frank. Frank's sentence was reduced to 15 years. His mother returned to North Carolina, and his wife Ava went to Puerto Rico. Once Frank finishes his time in prison, Richie gets there to meet him, and they walk the streets to a new future. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.